On a deserted road, the little dog Lucy was lying on the shoulder, motionless, lying on her side, breathing, but every breath seemed to cost too much. Two small puppies, caramel-colored just like her, stayed leaning against their mother's body. They didn't understand. They just stayed there, quiet, as if the heat from that body was the only real thing in the world. A truck went by. It didn't even slow down. A passenger car went by. The window was rolled up, the AC was on, and inside played a song that nobody remembers the name of anymore. Nobody stopped. The sun beat down hard. The dust rose with every vehicle that passed and settled back down, slowly, over everything. And then the third puppy moved. He was the smallest of the three. Caramel like his mother, with one ear folded forward, that ear that seemed like an unimportant detail. He buried his snout into Lucy's neck. She didn't respond like before. Something was different, and he, at 18 days old, still without a name and without a history, seemed to know it in a way that can't be explained with words. He stepped back, stopped, looked at his mother, looked at the road, and crossed. An 18-day-old puppy, all alone, crossing a county road where no adult had stopped. Another car went by. The wind almost knocked him over. He wobbled, steadied his little paws, and kept going. On the other side of the road, about 400 yards away, there was a house, an old wooden fence, a window with the blinds half open. The puppy didn't know if anyone was there. He didn't know if anyone would open the door. He knew absolutely nothing about that place. He only knew that his mother needed help, and he went. And as he walked along that dirt shoulder with paws so small they barely made a path through the grass, nobody on the road imagined what that decision, made without words and without any guarantees, was about to set in motion. What that puppy carried in that folded ear, you will understand before the end of this story. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, do it now and hit the bell. Every week there's a story like this, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Lucy hadn't chosen that road by chance. 3 weeks earlier, she had traveled almost a mile sniffing the wind, dodging fences, crossing a shallow creek that barely reached the knee. She was pregnant, and time was running out. Every instinct inside her pointed in a single direction: find a safe place. Find it before it's too late. And then she found it. Thick brush along the edge of the county road, set back far enough to stay away from the noise of the trucks, protected by a dense thicket that blocked the wind and rain. The ground was soft there, covered in dry leaves that muffled any sound. Lucy went in, turned around 3 times slowly, sniffed every corner and lay down. It was there. 3 puppies were born in that place, on a Tuesday morning when the fog still covered the treetops. Lucy licked each of them in silence, with a care that didn't need to be taught. The smallest came last. He was the quietest, and the most restless at the same time. He would stay still for seconds, as if he were thinking. Then he would crawl out in all directions, knocking over his siblings, exploring the edges of that nest as if the world was already too small. It was Lucy who brought him back every single time, with her snout gently, without judgment. Those first days were simple. Lucy would go out early in the morning to fetch water from the creek. She'd come back, nurse the 3, stay alert to the sounds from the road. In the afternoon, when the sun got hotter, she positioned her body to cast a shadow over the puppies. At night, she wrapped them in the warmth of her own fur. It was a routine without a name, but it was a life, and it had cost too much to be thrown away. Lucy hadn't had an easy life before that brush. She had lived in a house for almost 2 years, had an owner, a bowl with her name on it, a favorite rug near the window. She had learned that when the front door opened in the afternoon, it was time for joy. She had slept at the foot of a bed that smelled familiar. And then one day, the move happened. Boxes, strange people, a walk to the gate that she thought was just a regular stroll, and the gate closing from the outside. She waited. Day turned to night. Night turned to day. The gate didn't open. There was no judgment in Lucy's eyes at that moment, because dogs don't judge the way we do. What was there was confusion, a weight that kept getting heavier. And then, when hunger spoke louder, she walked away. All she had done after that was try to survive. And when life grew inside her, all she did was try to protect it. That was Lucy's only crime, trying to be a mother. 18 days after the puppies were born, on that morning that seemed like all the others, she left the brush to get water. The curve on the county road was a blind spot. The truck was coming fast. The brakes were too late. There's no need to describe what happened. It's enough to say that when the dust settled, Lucy was on the shoulder, motionless, and the truck had kept going. The two older puppies came out of the brush when they sensed she wasn't coming back. They found their mother. They stayed there, leaning against her, as if the sheer weight of their small bodies could hold on to something that was slipping away. The smallest, the one with the folded ear, kept looking a while longer. He sniffed his mother, sniffed the ground around her, looked both ways down the road with those eyes that could barely see past 6 feet. And then he did what the others didn't. While all this was happening on that nameless road, about 400 yards away, Anthony was sitting on the wooden chair in the living room, with the TV on, without volume. He had woken up at 7:30, like always. He had warmed up coffee. He had looked at Teresa's mug that was still in the exact same spot on the shelf. He couldn't bring himself to move it. And he had decided, just like he had decided for the past 8 months, that today there was no reason to go out either. 61 years old. A heart that needed rest, the doctor said. Debts that wouldn't rest, the bank said. And a house that had frozen in time the day he came back from the cemetery and realized the silence had a different weight now. Anthony didn't know that a couple of 100 yards away, a mother was lying on a shoulder. He didn't know that 2 confused puppies were waiting without understanding. He didn't know that the smallest of the 3 had just crossed a road alone and was walking toward his fence. He didn't know any of that yet, but the runt of the litter, the one with the folded ear, was arriving. The first to pass was Dave. 43 years old, trucker. He knew that road like he knew the lines on his own hand. He saw Lucy on the shoulder when he was still 200 yards away. He slowed down a little, enough to see, not enough to stop. Then he sped up again. Later, at a gas station 20 miles away, Dave would mention to the attendant, "Saw a dog down on the county road. She's a goner, I think." And he drank his coffee from a foam cup without another thought on the matter. He had a delivery to make. He had a deadline. He had bills to pay. It wasn't a lack of heart. It was the kind of choice that a rush manufactures without asking permission. The second was a couple. Silver car, big city license plates. They were driving back from a family farm, the trunk full of fruit and a hammock folded in the back seat. The woman saw it first. She said, "Look, a dog right there." The husband slowed down, drove past slowly. She grabbed her phone, rolled down the window just enough to snap a picture. She would post it later with the caption, "Poor thing. Somebody needs to do something." She would get 42 likes. None of them would come back to help. The car sped up. The 2 puppies that had come out of the brush watched the vehicle pass by without stopping. They stood still on the shoulder for a moment, as if still waiting for someone to change their mind. Then they went back close to Lucy. The third was Mrs. Nancy, 68 years old, walking back from the store with a plastic bag in each hand. She saw the folded ear puppy walking along the edge of the road in the opposite direction, toward Anthony's house. The puppy noticed her, stopped, barked with that raspy voice that barely made a sound. Mrs. Nancy took 2 steps back. "Go away, shoo, you might carry diseases." She kicked the air, not at the puppy, but close enough to scare him. The puppy dodged, kept walking. Mrs. Nancy went on her way, adjusting her bags, muttering something about stray dogs loose in the street. The fourth was Tyler, 17 years old, coming on a bicycle. He saw Lucy and actually stopped, got off the bike, just stood looking. He even took 2 steps toward her. The puppies next to Lucy lifted their heads. Tyler lowered his body, reached out his hand. He was about to do something, didn't know what yet, but he was about to. That was when his dad appeared on the side of the road, about 30 yards back, coming on foot. He called his son's name in a tone that left no room for argument. "Tyler, let's go. You're late for work." Tyler looked at his dad, looked at Lucy, looked at his dad again. "But she's not our problem. Let's go." Tyler straightened up, grabbed his bike, and rode away without looking back, because if he looked, he wouldn't be able to leave. There's a type of cruelty that doesn't look like cruelty. It doesn't scream, it doesn't hit, it doesn't curse. It just walks by. It just takes a picture. It just kicks the air. It just pulls its son by the arm. And in the end, the result is the same. Someone gets left behind. Lucy was left. The 2 puppies next to her were left. And with every car that passed without stopping, the dust rose and settled back down over everything, slow and indifferent, like someone who has seen this movie before. About 400 yards away, Anthony had his back to the window, washing the coffee mug with that slowness of someone who isn't in a hurry because he has nowhere to be. The blinds were half open. Outside, a small puppy, exhausted, with one ear folded forward, had just arrived in front of the gate, and he was scratching the wood. The sun had changed positions. It was no longer that midday sun that beats down on everything with violence. It was a late afternoon sun, lower, more orange, stretching the shadows and warming things differently, not with force, but with persistence. The kind of heat that tires you more than the other because it doesn't let up. Lucy remained on the shoulder. Her breathing had changed. It wasn't that rushed rhythm of the first few hours anymore. It had gotten more spaced out, deeper, as if every cycle required a decision. Her body was still, heavy, surrendered to the dirt ground, as if she had made her peace with it. Honey and Buster, the 2 puppies that stayed, had stopped whimpering. In the beginning, right after the accident, they called out, small, high-pitched barks that rose and faded in the wind off the road. But no car stopped because of those sounds, no window rolled down, and at some point, without anyone being able to say exactly when, the 2 puppies just went completely silent, leaning against their mother's body, absorbing the heat that was still there, quiet with the involuntary wisdom of someone who hasn't yet learned how to lie to themselves. The silence on that curve of the road had texture. It was made of the sound of crickets starting up slowly, one by one, like an orchestra warming up before the concert. It was made of the low wind, brushing through the grass without rushing. It was made of the distant rumble of an engine that would appear, grow, and vanish, leaving nothing behind. And then a white car slowed down. Honey lifted her head. Buster stirred. Lucy, in a reflex coming from somewhere deeper than consciousness, tried to lift her neck. The car parked on the shoulder about 50 feet away. The driver's side door opened slowly. A man stepped out. 50-something, plaid shirt, faded cap. He stood by the car for a moment, looking in Lucy's direction. The puppies stayed alert. Lucy tried to move again, a small effort, almost unnoticeable, but real. The man opened the back door, grabbed something. It was an empty soda bottle. He walked up to the edge of the road, far from Lucy, and tossed the bottle into the brush. Then he walked back to the car, shut the door, and drove off. The engine sound faded into the curve. Honey lowered her head. Buster leaned back against his mother's body, and the silence came back, heavier than before, because this time it had arrived with hope and left with nothing. The sky was turning a copper tone. When the sun hits that specific late afternoon angle, country backroads gain a beauty that doesn't match what sometimes happens on them. The light turns golden. The trees look warm, And everything looks like part of a painting someone made, without knowing there would be suffering in the foreground. Lucy closed her eyes for a moment. The crickets were at full volume now. Far away, a dog from some farm barked twice and stopped. The grass swayed. A white egret flew low over the road, in a straight line, indifferent and elegant. Life all around hadn't stopped. It had just moved on, without including her. At that exact moment, about 400 yards away, Anthony was in the kitchen. He had decided he would eat dinner early today. He opened the fridge, stared at the 3 options inside, shut the fridge without taking anything. He turned on the bedroom TV, lay down on the bed fully dressed, shoes still on his feet, and stared at the ceiling with that look of someone who isn't really seeing the ceiling. The doctor had told him, "Less stress, Anthony. You need peace." And he had found the peace of emptiness, which is no peace at all. He was about to turn out the light when the sound arrived. Weak, irregular, like something small knocking on wood without enough force but without stopping either. He held still, listening. Again, and one more time. Anthony sat up on the bed, stayed perfectly still for a few seconds with his hands on his knees, weighing something that didn't have a name yet. Then he stood up, walked over to the door, put his hand on the doorknob. From outside, a small and raspy voice insisted. Anthony opened the door, and there he was. A puppy so small, he fit with plenty of room between the jamb and the threshold. Caramel, filthy with red dirt, with an ear folded forward that gave his snout a somewhat asymmetrical, half-finished look. His eyes were too big for the size of his body. His legs trembled slightly, not from fear but from exhaustion. That little animal had walked 400 yards all alone, and his body was charging him the toll. Anthony looked at him. He looked at Anthony. And then he barked, just once, that raspy, thin voice that barely made it out, but did. "My God," Anthony said softly, to no one. "Where did you come from?" He stood there on the threshold for a moment, hands still on the knob, weighing what he was looking at. 61 years old. A heart the doctor had classified as stable, but requiring care. Debts from Teresa's treatment that still showed up every month in the mailbox, like uninvited guests. A pension that barely paid the bills, and sometimes didn't pay them at all. The doctor had been clear. You can't be stressed out, Anthony. No physical exertion, no getting involved in problems that aren't yours. Problems that aren't yours. Anthony looked at the puppy again. The puppy took 2 steps inside the house, stopped, looked back toward the road, then looked at Anthony a second time, like he was explaining something in a language one of them hadn't mastered yet. Anthony picked up his cell phone and called Robert. It rang 3 times. On the 4th, his son picked up with the tone of someone who was right in the middle of something. "Dad, you okay?" "I'm fine. A puppy showed up here at my door. Tiny little thing. He's alone." A 2-second silence. "Dad, don't open the door for stray dogs. They might have—" "I already did." Another silence. "Then close it again. Put him outside and close it. You're supposed to be resting. You can't be stressing over these things." Dr. Miller was very clear. He was. "So, Dad." "I'm listening, Robert." "Close the door." Anthony looked down at the puppy. The puppy had taken 2 more steps toward the street and stopped again, looking back, with that quiet insistence of someone who lacks vocabulary but has urgency. "I'm hanging up, son. Bye." "Dad!" Anthony hung up, stood there for a moment with the phone in his hand, looking at that 18-day-old creature who had crossed a road all alone, walked 400 yards, scratched at a door until someone opened it, and was now trying to communicate something with the only tool he had. He wasn't an animal guy, never owned a dog. Teresa had always wanted one, and he had always put it off with the excuse of work, of the rush, of later. Now there was no more later with Teresa, and there was a puppy on his doorstep. There was something in that small, insistent look that Anthony recognized. It was the same look of someone who needs help but doesn't know if they'll get it, of someone knocking on a door, not knowing if anyone will open it, of someone who went to the absolute limit of where they could go and is waiting for someone else to cover the rest. Anthony had been in that exact place 8 months ago, sitting on a bench in the ICU, waiting for news that didn't come back good. He put his phone away in his pocket, grabbed his slip-ons from behind the door, looked down at the puppy and said, with a voice that had rusted from so little use, "All right, but you're going to show me where it is." The puppy turned and went, and Anthony followed. This channel exists to tell stories that most people will never see. If this story touched you, leave your like right now and tell me the name of your city in the comments. Thousands of people are watching this video right at this moment. Many of them might be your neighbors. Tell me where you're from and I'll reply to everyone. The puppy led the way. Anthony walked behind, with rubber soles on the cracked pavement. No jacket, no flashlight, no plan. The sun was almost on the horizon, and the orange in the sky had turned into that dirty purple right before it gets dark. The road was empty at that moment, just the two of them, a 61-year-old man who the doctor had told not to stress out, and an 18-day-old puppy who hadn't received any such orders. The puppy stopped every now and then, looked back, made sure Anthony was coming and kept going. Anthony didn't say a word during those 400 yards. He just walked. When they reached the curve and he saw Lucy, he stopped. She was lying on her side on the shoulder, with the two puppies pressed against her. Honey and Buster raised their heads when they felt a human presence. Lucy tried to move, a tiny attempt, almost purely an intention, and couldn't. Anthony stood still about 10 feet away. He had spent his whole life working as an accounting clerk, didn't know about animals, didn't know about injuries. What he understood right then was that there was a mother down on a road, 3 puppies around her, and not another soul anywhere in sight. He crouched down slowly, kneeled on the warm pavement. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey, I'm here. You can stay still." Lucy turned her eyes toward the sound. There was no fear in that look. There was something more akin to the exhaustion of being afraid, like someone who had already spent all their energy resisting and now only needed to know if they could trust. Anthony reached his hand out slowly, palm facing up, and waited. Lucy didn't flinch. He rested his fingers on her neck, carefully, and stayed like that for a moment, just feeling it. The temperature of the skin under the fur, the rhythm of the breathing that rose and fell slowly. "It's all right," he said again. To her or to himself? He wasn't sure. Took off the shirt he was wearing, an old button-down shirt that Teresa had washed so many times the fabric had softened until it was almost like gauze, and folded it in 4. Placed it next to Lucy, without moving her yet, without attempting anything he didn't know how to do right. Then he grabbed his phone and called Gary. Gary lived about half a mile down. He was 64 and had an old Ford pickup that always had something wrong with it but always ran. He was the kind of neighbor Anthony had politely ignored for the last 8 months, answering his waves from the window with a wave back and nothing more. Gary picked up on the second ring. "Gary, I need you, right now." There was no pleading in the sentence. It was a statement. And Gary, who had known Anthony before Teresa died and had seen what grief had done to the man, recognized something in his neighbor's voice he hadn't heard in a long time. "I'm on my way." The pickup truck arrived in 7 minutes. Gary got out, saw the situation, didn't ask any drawn-out questions. He just said, "We're going to need something to put her on without hurting her more." Walked back to the truck, dropped the tailgate, pulled out a folded tarp he kept back there for everyday use. They spread the tarp on the ground next to Lucy. Anthony spoke to her the entire time they did it, short sentences in that same low tone. "It's going to be okay. I'm right here. It's going to be okay." Not because he thought she understood the words, but because silence, in that moment, felt wrong. When they moved Lucy onto the tarp, she let out a sound, not a scream, nothing dramatic, just a deep and suppressed noise that lasted less than a second. Anthony closed his eyes for a moment. Then he kept going. They placed her carefully into the bed of the truck. Anthony climbed in back, sat right next to her, keeping his hand flat against her flank the whole ride. The 3 puppies were put inside a cardboard box Gary found in the cab. On the way into town, Anthony thought about the money. Dr. Emily, he had seen the name of the vet clinic once, on a flyer that came in the mail months ago, and he'd thrown away, charged for emergency visits. He didn't know how much. He knew that in the bank, envelope was the cash he had saved up for next month's health insurance. He knew that if he used that, the month of March would be cutting it close. He would use it anyway. There wasn't much to think about on the matter. There was a mother in the truck bed and 3 puppies in a box, and somebody needed to do something. Dr. Emily took them in without any drama, examined Lucy with focus and an economy of motion, spoke with the direct tone of someone who picked that profession because they'd rather take action than offer comfort. A fractured pelvis, she confirmed. Absolute rest. 6 weeks, bare minimum. Ongoing treatment. The look of someone who knows they're delivering news that has a price tag. Anthony signed the paperwork and didn't ask about the total in front of Gary. While Lucy was being stabilized in the back, Anthony sat in the waiting room with the cardboard box on his lap. The folded-ear puppy had scaled the side of the box and had his front paws resting on the edge, looking straight up at Anthony. Anthony stared down at him for a long moment, and for the first time in 8 months, he did something he had forgotten he still knew how to do. He smiled. It was small, almost undetectable. But it was there. What he didn't know yet was how much that dog was going to need him over the coming weeks, and how much, without anyone planning it, without anyone asking for it, he was going to need her right back. Dr. Emily had been perfectly clear. Lucy would need strict bed rest for 6 weeks, no sudden movements, daily medication, follow-up visits every 10 days, and the puppies, at barely 18 days old, needed constant warmth, feedings every 3 hours, and a level of attention an immobilized mother wouldn't be able to provide alone. Anthony listened to all of that, sitting in the plastic chair at the clinic, with the cardboard box still on his lap and the folded-ear puppy sniffing the sleeve of his shirt. He went home with Lucy in Gary's truck bed, the 3 puppies in the box, and a handwritten list of instructions from the vet. The first day was silent chaos. Anthony rigged up a bed for Lucy in a corner of the living room, using old blankets he had kept in the back of the closet. Lucy lay there, quiet, watching everything with those eyes that asked without demanding. The puppies were placed next to her, carefully, and the 3 settled in against their mother's body with the natural ease of those who don't yet know the world can be complicated. Anthony stayed awake until midnight, rereading Dr. Emily's instructions. On the 3rd day, the envelope arrived. It was from the bank, a past due notice for the loan he had taken out to cover the last few months of Teresa's treatment. $850. Due in 10 days. Anthony set the envelope down on the kitchen table and stared at it for a considerable amount of time. Then he went to feed the puppies. There was no other order to do things in. On the 7th day, Buster grew lethargic. It was late afternoon. Anthony was in the kitchen, mixing up the watery gruel the vet had showed him to supplement the puppy's diet, while Lucy couldn't nurse as regularly. When he walked back into the living room, Honey and the folded-ear puppy were moving around normally, but Buster was off in a corner of the box, way too quiet, not reacting to the smell of food. Anthony felt his heart race. That physical warning Dr. Miller had told him not to ignore. He called the clinic at 11 o'clock at night. Dr. Emily answered with the tone of someone who had been woken up but wasn't angry about it. She listened to the rundown of his symptoms. asked 2 questions, then said, "Probably a lack of body heat. Wrap him up in a warm towel and stick a bottle with warm water inside the box, wrapped in a cloth. Keep a close eye on him until morning." Anthony did exactly that. By 2 in the morning, Buster was back to normal. Anthony sat on the living room floor until 3, back against the wall with the box right next to him, listening to the tiny, lively sounds of the 3 puppies sleeping. And he realized, with a clarity that surprised him, that it had been hours since he'd thought about Teresa, not because he had forgotten, but because he'd had something else to think about. He didn't know yet if that was good or bad, but it was different. In the second week, Mrs. Gladys showed up. A neighbor from 2 lots down, white hair always tied back, an opinion always on standby. She came onto the porch carrying a jar of jam that was purely a pretext and said, peering into the living room through the cracked door, "Anthony, you're blowing your pension on street animals. That just isn't right. You've got debts, man." Anthony took the jar of jam. "Thank you, Gladys. I'm being serious. I know you are. Thanks for the sweets." And he shut the door with the politeness of someone who ends a conversation without picking a fight. Inside the house, Lucy had lifted her head toward the sound of his voice. Anthony looked over at her and said, "It's nothing at all." She rested her head back down on the blankets. Robert called on the 15th day. It wasn't a call to check in. It was a collection call, the kind a son makes without realizing he's collecting. "Dad, a letter came to my address here, from a hospital, saying there's an outstanding debt in your name." Anthony explained that he knew, that he was handling it, that everything was under control. Robert offered to wire him some money. Anthony said he didn't need it. Robert pushed. Anthony let his son talk, agreed with just enough to wrap up the call, and hung up with that familiar feeling that the 2 of them were communicating in languages that used the exact same words, but arrived at entirely different places. Then he slipped his phone into his pocket and went to change Lucy's bandages for the day. On that exact same day, Lucy tried to stand up. Not even half of the required rest period had passed. Anthony was turning his back for 30 seconds to grab her medication when he heard the noise, a stifled strain, a shift, the friction against the blankets. He spun around and saw Lucy with her front paws planted on the floor, trying to shove her own body upward. "No, no, no." He went over to her fast, dropped to his knees, placed his hands firmly yet gently on both sides of her body. "Stop. Stop it, Lucy." She stared at him, pushed back for 2 seconds, then gave in and lay back down. Anthony stayed kneeling right there for a moment, hands still resting on her body, his heart beating faster than Dr. Miller would ever approve of. He took a deep breath. Then he said, in a low voice that slipped out entirely unplanned, "You don't have to figure this out by yourself right now. I'm right here." He said it to her, but the words hung in the air in a way that filled up way more than just the space between them. Something was happening inside that house that didn't have a name yet. It wasn't just a rescue. It wasn't just caregiving. It was a trade neither of them had asked for, and that both were receiving without fully understanding the sheer size of the gift. And on the longest night of those weeks, when that bank bill crept back into Anthony's thoughts at 3 in the morning, the folded-ear puppy climbed out of the box, marched across the blankets, and plopped himself down right on top of Anthony's foot. It didn't solve a single thing, but it made everything a little more bearable. And sometimes that is exactly what makes the difference between giving up and pressing on. 2 months later, Anthony's house had noise. Not the noise of the television left on without volume. Not the noise of the heavy silence he had learned to inhabit after Teresa left. It was the noise of life. Little paws tapping against concrete floors, bowls scraping around, the short and excited yaps of 3 dogs who had figured out that the world held interesting smells in absolutely every corner. Lucy still walked with a slight hitch on her back left leg. Dr. Emily had explained that it might stay like that forever, a compromise her body had come up with, a way to keep moving that wasn't the original design but got the job done. Lucy didn't seem bothered by it. She roamed the house with the calm dignity of someone who's survived the worst of it and safely reached the other side. The contrast with that motionless figure out on the shoulder was almost impossible to believe if you hadn't been there for both moments. Honey had grown into her mother's personality, watchful, cautious, the kind of dog who pauses at the doorway to evaluate things before walking in. Buster had developed the total opposite personality, full of energy, clumsy, always the first to arrive anywhere and the last to understand why he'd gone, and the folded-ear puppy continued being what he had been right from the start, different, alert, with that habit of stopping and staring that gave off the impression that there was a lot more going on in his head than most folks realized. Anthony had a routine. It sounded simple saying it like that, but it wasn't. There had been 8 months of no routine, 8 months of days starting and ending with no set shape, with no emotional obligations, without a single concrete reason to get up before 9. Now there was. 6 in the morning, feeding time, 7 a short walk out on the sidewalk. Dr. Miller had recommended light walking, and Anthony had learned that 3 dogs made light walking mandatory because they stopped to inspect everything and he was forced to wait. At 9, Lucy's meds. Noon, feeding time again. In the afternoon, Dr. Emily had cleared them for some supervised sunlight out in the yard. Anthony had swept the yard for the first time in months to prep the space. He had chopped down the weeds that grew along the fence line, repaired a loose board on the gate. He'd done all those things without even noticing he was doing them, simply because they needed doing, and realizing that things needed doing was, all by itself, a way of coming back. Mrs. Gladys showed up on the porch on a Thursday morning. She spotted Anthony out on the sidewalk with the 3 dogs, wearing slip-ons and a clean shirt, waiting for Buster to sniff a stray branch for an unspecified amount of time. She watched him for a second before saying anything. When she finally spoke, her voice had shifted in tone. "You look different, Anthony, more present." Anthony looked over at her. "It's just that I've got things to do," he said. Simple as that. Mrs. Gladys nodded slowly, like someone who finally grasps a concept that took a while to become clear. She didn't say another word about wasting his pension on street animals. It was on a sunny afternoon that Anthony took his first picture. Lucy was lying down in the yard, inside a shady patch near the fence, with Honey curled up against her and Buster sleeping paws up about 2 feet away. The folded-ear puppy was sitting right beside Lucy, posture totally upright, staring down the gate with that sentry look he'd sported since he was 18 days old. Anthony stared at that scene for a good while before taking the shot. Then he snapped the picture. He kept the photo on his phone for 2 solid days without knowing what to do with it. Then, on a night when the silence felt much heavier than usual, he opened up his chat with Robert, a chat that had been deadlocked on a dry exchange of words regarding a hospital bill, and sent over the picture without any text. It took Robert 40 minutes to reply. When he finally did, it was just a heart emoji, but it was the first heart Robert had sent his dad since the funeral. Anthony stared at that tiny symbol on his screen for an amount of time entirely disproportionate to its size. Then he set his phone on the table and went to double-check if Lucy had taken her evening meds. There was something shifting between him and his son. Slowly, without either of them putting a name to it, without any dramatic talks or loud reconciliations. Just a photo, just one heart. But they were things that hadn't existed before, and now they did. The collar Anthony had bought for Lucy was simple, a solid blue, with a heavy-duty plastic clasp. He had strapped it on her during a morning follow-up visit at the clinic, with the exact same naturalness of someone doing a task that always should have been done. Lucy had sniffed the collar, looked up at Anthony, and moved right along. In that tiny gesture, there was something Anthony recognized instantly. It was trust, not the hyped-up trust of a puppy who hasn't learned to be suspicious yet, but built from the ground-up trust, the kind that survives a real hardship and comes out the other side more solid than before. It was the collar that had replaced the sheer emptiness of the shoulder, and Lucy wore it like someone who wears their own name. But the universe, which had been monitoring all of this with the patience of someone in absolutely no rush, still had one final thing tucked away for Anthony. Something he didn't ask for, didn't wait for, and that would show up in a way that wouldn't fit into any possible plan he could have drafted. His follow-up appointment with Dr. Miller was booked for a Tuesday morning. Anthony took the bus, just like always. He brought the folded ear puppy along in the carrier Dr. Emily had loaned him because Honey and Buster were getting too big for the crate, and the puppy was the smallest. And Anthony hadn't found anybody to watch all three of them at the same time. Dr. Miller was a man of very few words and intense focus. He checked his blood pressure, asked his usual list of questions, told Anthony to squeeze his hand, track his finger with his eyes, take a deep breath. He scribbled notes in the chart with the pen that stayed clipped to his coat pocket. Then he took off his glasses and looked at Anthony in a completely different way than usual. Your blood pressure dropped. Significantly. A pause. You sleeping all right? I am. Leaving the house. Every single day. The doctor glanced down at the carrier on the floor, where the unmistakable noise of a puppy deciding it was high time to be noticed was coming from. He yours? He is, Anthony said. And the words came out with a naturalness he hadn't planned for. Dr. Miller jotted down one more note, then said, with zero drama, with the sheer objectivity of someone logging a clinical fact, bonds with animals have consolidated evidence for improving depressive and cardiovascular profiles. Routine, emotional responsibility, a solid reason to leave the house. He looked Anthony in the eye. Whatever happened over these last 2 months, you need to keep doing it. Anthony nodded. It was right on his way out of the clinic that he bumped into Dr. Emily. She had gone over there to drop off lab work for a referred patient, the sort of coincidence that only feels like a setup when you look back on it later. She spotted Anthony, spotted the crate, and crouched down to greet the folded ear puppy with that deep familiarity of someone who had monitored every visit, every follow-up, every tiny bit of Lucy's progress. The puppy pressed his snout directly into her hand and stayed like that. Dr. Emily looked up at Anthony with a smile that carried a hint of a confession. This little guy right here, I've been getting attached appointment by appointment, she said. Ever since the first time you brought Lucy in. He'd stand right next to her on the exam table like he was the one in charge. Anthony looked down at the puppy, looked over at the vet. Do you want him? Dr. Emily went perfectly quiet for a second. I wasn't going to ask for that. I know you weren't. Anthony popped the latch on the crate slowly. But I'm the one asking. She looked at the puppy for a very long moment. Then she said, I already have a name picked out for him. Since the second visit. She paused. Hero. Anthony froze with his hand resting on the crate door. Hero. The puppy who had crossed a road all alone at just 18 days of life, who had marched 400 yards, who had scratched at a door until someone finally opened it, who had kept checking over his shoulder until he was absolutely certain the man was following him. All right then, Anthony said. The voice came out solid, but there was something inside it that needed a second to settle down. But I want updates on how he's doing. Always. Always, she confirmed. 3 days later, Robert called. It wasn't a collection call. His voice was different, slower, way more careful, the kind that rehearses a thing before speaking it out loud. Dad, I saw the pictures you sent over. Of Lucy, the pups, the yard. A beat. Can I drive out there this weekend? Anthony stood totally still, holding his phone. You can, he said. The house is open. Robert pulled up on Saturday morning. When the front gate opened, Lucy went right up to the front with that slightly hitched walk that had become entirely hers. Honey tagged along. Buster ran out first and then sprinted right back for no apparent reason. Robert walked in, crouched down, and let the dogs come over to him. Anthony stood in the doorway watching his son, who had stayed way too distant for way too long, finally cross back over. The house that had frozen in time was now filled with motion, and what was once empty had gone back to being a home. There is a lie that adult life teaches remarkably well, that courage is only for those who have nothing left to lose, that only those who are secure take action, that caring is a luxury reserved strictly for when every other bill is fully paid. And then an 18-day-old puppy shows up, completely alone on a nameless road, crossing the asphalt without any guarantees whatsoever, and that entire lie just collapses. The folks with cars stopped to snap photos. The folks with good legs kept right on walking. The folks with a voice declared it wasn't their problem. And the only one who went the distance was a 61-year-old man with a compromised heart, debt at the bank, and 8 months of heavy grief on his back. Not because he had more to give, but because he chose differently. There are things that only make sense looking backward. I catch myself thinking about the physical size of that puppy. He could fit in the palm of your hand, but he carried something many adults have lost: the absolute certainty that it is worth trying, even without a guarantee. He didn't know if that man would open his door. He didn't know if he'd actually get help. He only knew his mother needed it. And he went. And I look over at Anthony, who had given up on ever needing anyone, and I see that he was saved by the exact same creature he went to save. Sometimes purpose doesn't show up with a warning. It shows up with 4 paws and a folded ear. And you, what would you have done? If that puppy had scratched at your door that afternoon, with the huge eyes and the raspy voice that barely made a sound, would you have opened it? Or would you have had a highly reasonable excuse for keeping it shut? You don't have to answer me, but it's worth answering for yourself. Adopt, love, never abandon. On a nameless road on a late afternoon under an orange sun, a puppy smaller than 2 handspans crossed the world at 18 days of life because he didn't know any other way to exist. And on the other side stood a man who had bolted every single door shut, and who went ahead and opened this one. Lucy walks with a slight hitch in her step. Robert visits every single month now. Hero sleeps in Dr. Emily's office with his ear folded forward, the exact same way he always had it. And Anthony wakes up at 6 in the morning because he has things to do. Sometimes life doesn't send you a sign. It sends a puppy. The question was never whether he needed help. The question was always whether somebody was going to open the door.